recording.
This meeting is being recorded.
All right. Welcome to the Gateway API meeting for July 25th, 2022. We have a relatively light agenda today. If you have anything last minute that you've thought of, please feel free to add it to the end of the agenda here. Let's just get started with the reminder about Gamma meeting starting tomorrow. So this has been coming for a couple of weeks now. For those of you who aren't initiated, the Gamma initiative has to do with using Gateway API for mesh, and a separate meeting and kind of a working group, more or less, but not an official working group, has been formed to try to drive that forward. So the first meeting, if I'm understanding correctly, starts tomorrow at the same time, but it will alternate week by week. So it'll be 6 p.m. Eastern or 3 p.m. Pacific time on Tuesday, and then the following week it'll be 8 p.m. Pacific time or 11 p.m. Eastern on the alternating week.
I think you mean 8 a.m. on the alternate week.
Oh, was it 8 a.m.? That works for me. I
yes. Yeah.
Cool. Is there anything else? Is Keith on here? Does anybody else want to say anything else about Gamma and the meetings and stuff like that? Or is that pretty much it?
Pretty much it. Sorry, I just wanted to put it out there that I know everyone likes the official sounding working group thing, but it's actually not necessary. It's only for cross-SIG collaboration. So like a sub-project is a perfectly official activity of the SIG.
Sure.
I thought we were calling it the Gamma Initiative because it sounds cool, personally.
Sounds like something out of Marvel.
Exactly.
All right. And then Jeff, you wanted to talk about route delegation.
Sure. Maybe it'd help if you open up the preview. Yeah, I'm going to choose the one that you didn't choose. So it's been a while since we've discussed this. Now that we've got the 0.5 release out, we'd like to get moving on this again. So for those of you that aren't familiar with it, because we do have some people that have been joined us more recently, this is about having an ability to create multiple routes that point to another route, or in other words, a parent-child relationship between routes. So a child route could basically it's the back-end reference in a sense of a parent route. So this is a fairly long document, the SCEP. It has a lot of details in it, a lot of explanations. It also has a very extensive section on statuses as it relates to how things fail and such. So it's time to get back and start reviewing this again and making comments. One of the issues that I am aware of, since I originally wrote this with some help from Mike Morris on my team, is that it basically assumes that the controller has an awareness of the current runtime configuration. So that when you were to make a change to a route, and if that to a child route, and that was somehow incompatible with settings in a parent route, the idea is it would not make a change to the existing deployed route. However, that might be a problem if you don't know what the current running state is, or at least potentially, depending on how you want to look at it. So I'd encourage everybody that is involved in implementations to carefully evaluate how it describes things, and see if you think you can work with that, or if it would be a challenge for you the way it's described here. I will say this, that when it comes to the description of and talking about operating state or running state or currently deployed state, that is not a hard requirement of it that you have to maintain state. It's simply a way of expressing the concepts. So if you ignore that fact and just look at what the behavior is, I should say it's a way of describing behavior, not a way of implementing it. Maybe that's a better way to put it. So keep that in mind, that it's not dictating exactly how you implement the logic. It's simply a way of expressing what the logic is.
I have a question. I'm taking a look at it right now. Are we saying this is a requirement in terms of how we're talking about it, or
it would not? It's not intended to be core, so it would be a extended feature.
I meant the ephemeral, like how the binding is treated. Reconciliation. I'm looking at the section about binding and
it's intended
I guess
to,
like how specific is the intent of requirement versus this is a way to describe what's happening.
It's intended to describe what the expected behavior is. So
I see. So it is a requirement to be sort of, if you read through it, it is kind of expected as, okay, this is how implementations should behave.
It's how they should behave. It's not necessarily how it's implemented, if that makes sense.
I think this is like lots of other extended features, Bowie, in that you don't have to do it, but if you do it, it must behave in this certain way. Must is the word, not should. The whole feature is optional, but like if you implement the feature, it must behave in a certain way, and we'll conformance test that to make sure that.
Correct. I'm wondering about the ephemeral and sort of like more nitty gritty stuff.
Let me. I think I understand you. But let me express it this way. Say an implementation does not maintain what the current state is, and so what it would do is it just always updates the system whenever there's a change, but it can see what is configured. So all the existing routes, gateways that are configured, and it could say, looking at this, what's currently configured, this change you've made to this route would be in conflict with the other things that have already existed, and so I'll reject it on that for that purpose. So it's not necessarily not necessary to maintain a what I've currently deployed point of view.
And what if you modify the parent route first and becomes inconsistent because the parent route is modified, or if then
I think there's a lot for us to think through about the status, about this and current state. There's a couple of Mike just put a thing in the chat about it. So I think, and we've done a bunch of work on like status and current state and how we handle like, the problem is that this system is eventually consistent. So you can't always be sure that you know the before state and the after state. Before and after are a bit fuzzy. And so I think the point that the ephemeral thing has in there, there's two things that I just need to talk about quickly. The question that Bowie asked about the ephemeral route. The ephemeral route thing is like a way to think about what's happening here. Like what you're doing by, yeah, exactly, Constant. What you're doing by doing this is that you're kind of taking all of the routes that could possibly end up together, and you're trying to build like a singular route object that puts them all together, right? Like, so it's kind of like the ephemeral route is a thing that you don't actually need to create like an actual route object or something, or a data structure, but you need to think about it as being, at some point, you're going to need to build like something that looks like a single, like a big single gateway with a whole bunch of single route, like with a whole tree of routes attached to it. That you're going to have to do that when you write it down to whatever data plane you're doing anyway. So like,
right. I think
using that word to say is like, hey, you're going to have to do something like this before, and using that ephemeral route to sort of talk about the state in which everything is sort of attached in, and you have like one big object rather than a series of smaller objects, is like a way to describe what's probably going to need to happen in your implementation.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. It's basically the resolve config.
Yes.
Just another high level comment for those of especially Jeff and everyone driving this proposal. This one definitely seems like one that we need feedback from users. Do we have any thoughts about once this gets in some form, like what we want to see?
I can
And-
speak from the console side and say that we've had customers that have expressed this a need for this kind of capability. As a matter of fact, we support it in our own data model.
Yeah, and Contour has a similar thing as well. So like this is not coming out of nowhere. There is prior art here. Implementations have done similar things in the past. In fact, a lot of the feedback that I have given has been on the basis of what the Contour stuff has done. So I think, and Costin, I think you've made some comments in chat about like, you know, how the I think one of the things that we've got here is that ephemeral stuff is not intended to be a requirement for implementers to do. You don't have to build an ephemeral route as like an intermediate object, right? Like it's a way of thinking about what the routes are doing. And so I think we could probably clear up the language there to say like, we're using this to explain what it's doing. You don't have to use this as, that doesn't have to be the way that you implement.
I think you're getting to something very important here. I mean, it's what happens is very complicated to understand. I mean, combining two routes with multiple headers, hard headers, different regexes or whatever, it's becoming mathematically impossible to compute for anyone. So I think one of the things that I asked when I reviewed this document, I think I put it in comments, is to have a simplified basically version, where you maybe restrict to only hostname and path prefixes, or have some restrictions, so at least regexes don't come into picture, because with regex in both routes it will be absolutely impossible for anyone to understand anything. And the second comment, I think, which is very important, is semantically this should be equivalent with having two gateways. So you have one gateway implemented with the first route, and the backend would be another gateway that implements the second route. If we can guarantee that the semantic is identical with having two gateways, I think we are fine, and most of the complexity goes away.
I think that's going to move the complexity around in ways that are going to be even harder to understand, to be honest. I understand what you're saying. I do see that it kind of makes sense. Like in some ways it makes things easier, but the thing that we're actually doing here is not is trying to break up so to make it so that you can make it so that teams get access to bits of if you think of the way I've always talked about this is if you think of this domain URL space as a space, right? Like as a configuration space, a multi-dimensional configuration space, you can slice up that configuration space and hand responsibility for it to some people. That's what we're trying to do here. And so in Contour's implementation, sorry, just let me finish, and then I'll. In Contour's implementation, we explicitly did that by the relationship when you include one HTTP proxy in another, puts boundary conditions around the inclusion and says when you include a route inside another one, you get these conditions, and the person who has the included route has those conditions as like a superset. So yeah, you're kind of taking the domain, the URL space, and kind of giving you a chunk of it. And some of that space may be bounded by path, maybe bounded by headers, maybe bounded by method or something like that. But then if you do anything inside that goes against anything that you've been given by the person who owns the parent, then your thing will just not work, right? Like, the thing that you're trying to say, Costin, forgive me if I'm putting words in your mouth, is this is really complicated because there are so many features on a route. And I think that what we need to do here is, I understand it would be really nice that you can make it so that if you mess this up, you're not going to break the live config. But I think that this feature is too complex to do that. I think that what we're going to find is that we need to be really aggressive and just say, if you make a mistake, your thing will just not work. Like it'll just get chucked out, right? Like, because that's the only way that you can ensure the consistency, like across, controller restarts, and there's a whole bunch of other API machinery shenanigans that you just cannot do. It's not possible to have, there is too much complexity to manage to have this set up, this complicated a feature also make it so that if you break something, things don't blow up, right? Like it's just, there's too many, that adds too many dimensions to this problem. And so I think we need to be clear with people. If you are doing this, it is an advanced thing. If you break something, sorry, your shit's going to break, right? Like that's the best that we can do, right? That you want to do something really advanced, like there's only so much we can do to help you.
My point is really that it should not be that complex, and in reality, I mean, the ephemeral stuff doesn't solve the complexity. It's just, kind of, if you are lucky and you're doing the config change at runtime instead of in a CI/CD system that is pushing and the order is not deterministic, maybe you're lucky and you don't break stuff. But really, the problem is the complexity of combining two routes together, and the best way to solve it is, to express it in a way that is easy to understand, and having two gateways chained is how people implement this feature today, because it's not a new problem. A lot of people have one front end that is doing a set of routes, and then a second gateway per namespace or per team that is doing a secondary set of routes. It's very common. I mean, it's not something new.
That's not the focus or the intent behind this, though. As Nick was saying, the intent behind this is to allow administrative delegation within the gateway. And so how enterprises do this today is simply they have whoever's the admin for the gateways has to write more complex routing configuration and make sure that it's right for each application's requirements. And when an app needs a change, then they have to go to the gateway administrator and request that change, and so on and so forth. So that's what we're trying to avoid here. We're also trying to make let me finish real quick. One other aspect of it is, the other thing is we're trying to make it so that routes are more composable. So they are, you can have this, you don't have to have one huge route with all these different criteria, and you could use a child route in multiple parent routes. So you don't have a risk of configuration drift between different routes.
So it occurs to me that this PR has been around a while. And it is large and nebulous, complex, and that's part of what's holding it up. And we just spent a good almost 20 minutes talking about it in here, and I'm sure we could do that over and over again. So to move forward, because there's a need from multiple parties, does our machinery that we recently added for like experimental channel and stuff like that provide enough window to say, just push this through into a state that we can all agree is like okay to merge, but not okay to release? Like, do we have the machinery in place where we can work on this more iteratively, so it doesn't have to be this big giant PR anymore, and start chipping away?
Yeah, I think that's a weakness of the PR proposal thing, which I don't know is resolved. Is like, technically speaking, we should merge things anyways, but it's hard to like keep the comments on there. So I think since this has been discussed a lot, but we did kind of like completely context shift as a group to just get 5.0 out, I would say that it's probably worth this week, especially we're mentioning on Monday, is just like, hey, everyone, please look at this PR. And then probably next week we can kind of see like, hey, everyone's had a chance to kind of refresh their brain. Like, where do we feel? And we put it as agenda item next week to see whether or not it's possible to merge it in some form. That's my recommendation.
I think that's a good suggestion. There's one thing I wanted to call out. I'm going to share my screen real quick. Nope, can't. So Shane, if you wanted to show the preview again,
you can share your screen now. You're a co-host.
Oh, so. There we go. Thank you. So I just wanted to call this out right here, which because I think it's important, Bowie, what you brought up about the ephemeral routes. And so I just wanted to point out this statement in here because it really goes to address your question. So it's the ephemeral routes are used to describe behavior, not necessarily to dictate implementation. So maybe that helps. And if we can rework how we define this a little bit to make it more clear, I'm happy to do that.
Yeah, this approach makes sense to me. I wanted to, while you have this up, I wanted to just, there was one area where it describes just the specific changes that would need to happen to the API.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if we could just refresh at least my memory and anyone else's memory of what we're actually proposing here, because I think that's
Sure.
a good.
Yeah. So there's, let's make sure I've got the right section. Yes. So this is the main set of changes to the API itself. So the HTTP route rule would allow you to define allowed routes in addition to backend ref. So that's how you would do the inclusion. At this point, we're saying that you might be able to, or you would be allowed to have both a backend ref and a included route. Route rules, I'm sorry. Another thing that we're requiring is that the parent route would have to be the same type specifically. So you couldn't have a child route that's an HTTP route with a parent that's a TCP route. And that's one of the places where the concept of treating it like two gateways breaks down, because if you want to do this in one gateway, you may not be able to do that. The way your data layer is implemented. It does include adding section names basically to the route rules, just to make it help make it clear where a route is being inserted into the routes or the route rules. I think.
Yeah, I think those last couple are the key ones.
Yeah. The parent, a route can't be both a parent and a child, so that avoids any chance of circular reference.
I think importantly, it also avoids the fact that it means that the tree can only be 3 resources deep: gateway, parent route, child route. That's it. No, nothing else.
Yep. And then which I meant, something I mentioned a little bit earlier, is a child could have multiple parents, just like a parent can have multiple childs. So this is a way to where you need a partial configuration in multiple different gateways. This allows you to define that config once and then reuse it by reference in multiple gateways. So you don't have a risk of configuration drift between the different gateways. So that's the reason for allowing multiple parents for a single child.
Yeah, exactly. I think there's been a bit of discussion in the chat as well while Jeff was explaining that, and I think there's a couple of things that came up in the chat that I think we need to be super clear on. Firstly, there is nothing in the spec today that prohibits you from having a gateway resource that requires another gateway resource to work. In fact, that's kind of how we intended and expected layer 7 ingressy controller style gateway implementations to work, that they would depend eventually on a layer 4 gateway that approximates the functionality of a services type load balancer, right? So there's no reason you can't layer things to some extent now and require a gateway. Sort of a gateway implementation needs something else that could be a gateway to work. That's 100% expected and the way that we expected this thing to work. I think that I understand what you're saying, Costin, that having multiple gateways be a semantic model, I think is a really bad idea because it breaks the idea that a gateway is a thing that sits at the end. A gateway is a construct that sits at the edge of a cluster. Like that is the thing that we have spun this whole API design around. Is a gateway is a thing that translates between stuff that knows about the cluster internals to stuff that does not know about the cluster internals. Violating that construct is going to be really confusing and make this already difficult to learn API even harder. Right. And so I think that we need to be really clear that that's what a gateway is. The gateway is a routing point that lets you know about. And so in terms of the layer 4, layer 7 thing, you're using a gateway to take layer 4 stuff that doesn't know about the cluster and get it into the cluster. And then you're using that as a way to expose something that speaks layer 7 that then has its own way of describing things. So you're composing layers in OSI model, not routing hops. I think that a gateway is not a routing hop, right? Like, and the administrative thing that we're talking about, like using gateways as listeners, like using gateways like as sort of parents and children would implies that they are routing hops, right? Like whether or not that's actually the case, that's the very clear implication from the API. And unless that's the way it's implemented, then I think that using that to handle this thing, I understand what you're saying. What we are proposing is very complex. Yes. I think the point that you are making is very fair, that a HTTP route has a lot of options and it's going to be very difficult to ensure that HTTP route parents and children have matching sets of stuff, right? Because, you can do method matching and header matching and regex and path and all, there's lots and lots of features in each of them. I think that there's possibly an argument that you could make that the child HTTP route could be a separate resource that has a cut down set of things in it, maybe. But like I would prefer to see us do like to try it out and see what happens, and then and see how hard the sort of conflict management is before we go down that path. Because as I said, there is prior art here, both Consul, Contour. I think other people have similar sort of admin delegation ideas that have kind of worked, right? Like even though it is complex, that's what I'm trying to say. I think that we're better off trying something like this, and I think that the proposal that we've got here is actually quite well thought out. We've spent a lot of time thinking about exactly how this stuff works, and I need to take another pass over the status stuff because I know that Mike and I have sort of back and forth on status for the base HTTP route a lot, and there's some changes that we have made there that I think are very relevant to this, especially stuff about when things will become unattached and when they won't, that are really, really important here. Like we've changed the rules a little bit about that a HTTP route with a backend ref that is valid but has 0 endpoints will still be attached. And so that's really relevant here because it's much more likely that you have a child HTTP route, and there are flow-on effects if a parent HTTP route has a valid allowed routes reference to a child that has 0 endpoints, then that is a different behavior to use stuff. And so this absolutely is expected to be, we are going to describe this behavior. So Costin, you're asking in the chat, can this be implemented as a vendor specific extension? The whole idea here is we are going to add this in as an experimental extended feature. Extended means no, you don't have to do it. You can still be conformant and not do this. It's 100% fine. In fact, it is expected. And then this is experimental. Yeah, it's experimental in that we may change it, right? Like if you implement it and we all find it goes pear-shaped and it doesn't work the way we think it does, then we'll change it, right? Like this is not final. And so that's why we have all of those versioning things, so that we can experiment with this and try it out in a way that if it does work out, we haven't all ended up doing our own implementations of this. Right? And
that's what I mentioned. Maybe I'm jumping ahead a little bit, is I am very curious to get feedback from users, because I know that we do a lot of discussion in terms of what it could be, but to see users give feedback would be great. So.
And I think that would also help kind of figure out some of the edge cases around status and attachment and things like that, to help define what should we reasonably expect in each of these failure scenarios, so that we can get to a well-defined behavior for the smallest scope. If we go with the things blow up approach versus the like initial proposal that suggests kind of like defaulting to currently implemented, currently accepted. Like the everything blows up is actually sometimes okay if it's immediate and in a small enough scope that it doesn't impact other things outside of that. So that's definitely some of the stuff that I'm looking forward to like getting user feedback on.
Go ahead, Rob.
Thank you. Yeah, I think I'm really echoing what everyone else has said here. Just, I think this is the perfect use of experimental channel. This is really the best test we have to make sure that experimental channel is the construct we hoped it would be. We need feedback. We need to test this out. And I think one of the risks we'd have if we had kind of every implementation or different implementations trying their own unique way to do this is we'd have more difficulty bringing this back to convergence later. So agreeing on this is what we're going to start with, this is how we're going to test initially, I think is a good starting point. It may not work, but I think we've had a lot of good thought on this one, and I'd like to at least see it get to experimental and get some feedback from there.
So Rob, how is this going to proceed? I mean, one vendor is going to implement it and users will try that vendor and see how it works and provide feedback, because I don't see how multiple vendors can accidentally come to the same implementation, given the complexity of combining routes. So is it one of the vendors will, just I will implement it, get feedback, and then other vendors may jump, or how we plan to do it?
As Nick and I have both mentioned, I mean, that this basic concept is already implemented in at least two different products, Console and Contour. And so we do have that experience that's feeding into this, and the customer feedback we've gotten from doing those, for each of those implementations, the feedback we've gotten as the people involved in those.
Yeah, so I think to be clear, the feedback that we have got from Contour is that this is useful for people who tend to run large multi-tenant style clusters, who have very complicated like organizational structures around a single cluster, right? Like I think that there's absolutely a large set of people at the moment who are moving towards having smaller clusters or single function clusters and stuff like that, where this is not applicable. So the next steps here are we need to make something in the spec so that then implementations may develop something against what we have, right? Like that's the only way that we're going to get some user feedback is to put a spec together, even if it's experimental and draft. We say, okay, here's what we need. Here's the way this feature works for now, experimental, blah, 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 blah. We say, this is the way you implement it. What we found in the past is that it's when the rubber meets the road of actually implementing things, you'll find a lot of edge cases you never thought of, because like, then you're actually writing the code to be like, how do I do this? And then people will be like, oh, well, when you do this and this and this, then this bit doesn't make sense, right? And that's like, but you can't do that without having some spec, right? Like this spec is never going to be perfect. It's probably, we're going to find problems as we implement it. But I think that deciding on something and moving forward with that and trying it out and getting implementer feedback first, and then once we do manage to get solid implementations, getting like people have tried this out feedback, even if it is the implementers, will be useful. So like I think that yes, there definitely should be concerns about how the implementations work and how the implementation actually works. But once some people have implemented it, then they can say, hey, these things were hard, these things were easy, this is what we did, like, yes. And some of the implementations are definitely Envoy based, yes. So Contour is Envoy based. Contour is an Envoy based thing. We have already done this, okay? So the data path is actually relatively irrelevant, right? Like it is all, the hard part is all about like taking the config and washing it together, right? Like exactly as you said, there's a lot of complexity there, but you can actually like manage that complexity by having a very clear, very specific set of rules about what happens when you have a conflict, right? So, and then as long as you don't do a conflict, everything's fine. And as long as you know what happens when you have a conflict, like then you can be, and that's why that stuff about like, do you sort of try and like keep the current config or just blow everything up is really important, because that's the conflict resolution rules, and the conflict resolution rules are the way to make something this complex actually work. So I think that's the key. I think that Toby unmuted a while ago. Did you have something to say?
Well, my comments, I guess, were more procedural, that I'm concerned about the sort of let's throw it in there and then decide what we want to do with it. Like, you know, the classic salesman shoe in the door, right? You know, there's a point at which things get momentum just by virtue of being in the spec. And it feels like we're allowing that decision to happen too lightly.
So
Okay.
I think the thing to take into account here is that this is not something new. This is something that a number of us have been discussing doing for probably close to a year, I'm thinking.
Been around a while.
Yeah, so so there are a number of us that want to see this implemented.
And I
Go
think
ahead, Shane.
importantly,
Or you
Jeff, to expand on that, like this is also not something that nobody's done before, right? Like Contour has been doing this for 3 years, right? Like we have had lots and lots of problems. We have solved them, right? Like that's why I'm talking a lot about this. This feature is not coming out of nowhere. It came from specific requirements that we got in Contour from our point of view. We had specific requirements for people who had big clusters to not have ingress objects stop all over each other. And so we built stuff. We built an ingress route resource that we then found didn't work properly. So we built a HTTP proxy route resource that had things work in a slightly different way. So this is like the third or the fourth revision of this idea, right? Like this is not the first revision of this idea. Like I understand what you're saying, that you're worried about, like, are we pushing this in? But like I can say with great confidence, there's absolutely people who want this thing. And we've done something like this before. Like this is not just coming out of nowhere, right? Like, and that's why we want to push it in, because for us to be able to, like, I'm worried that I have too many biases here around exactly how this works. And I need some other people to do something like it, but we can't do something like it without defining what something like it means.
Okay, like I say, I do have so for example, is this visible somewhere other than in raw markdown? You know, I see people showing screenshots. I mean, how would I have learned of this as somebody coming in only a few months ago? Is this I mean, again, I'm relatively new. I've been here a few months. Should I just go through all of the PRs in the PR queue and read them all? And, you know, or is there some pipeline that I can look at?
So the gaps are the pipeline. And so this is the gap is the gateway enhancement proposal. It mirrors what we do in upstream with the caps. And so like this is a PR to describe, this is a PR for a design for how to implement the gap that says do route delegation, right? Like, so the gap is like, do we want to do route delegation? And if so, how? And so this PR then is like Jeff's design for how he thinks we should do route delegation. So the things to look out for when you're reviewing, if you're going through the repo, are to look for issues tagged as gaps, and then to see if there is a design PR yet for them. That's how we do, like, that's how we discuss big changes. We will always discuss big changes like this in this meeting. That's what this meeting is for. If you see something you don't know about, or that we will not merge something this big without having discussed it substantially like this in the meetings here. And so that's why these meetings are key. I agree that probably there's more we could do to promote stuff, but like, yeah, like I mean, and possibly we can have more discussion in Slack. I think historically we haven't had enough people for it to be worth like putting the discussions in Slack as well. Now we are at the stage where we have enough people that, hey, we need to figure out what to do here. And it's a really good question. Thank you, Toby. But we don't have an answer yet.
People in the Slack channel. Yeah.
In the sensitivity and time in mind, since we're about 45 minutes in, I think that I have not seen too many things that have come through this meeting in the last couple of years that have had this much of a response, including in the chat. So given all that energy, I think focusing it at the PR comments this week so that we can get it moving along would be really good. So everybody who had something to say here, I would highly encourage you, get on the PR, say it, but try to keep in mind that we are trying to do this as an experimental thing, which means we can pull out anytime. We're not going to try to release it. And so try to see if you can push your bias a little bit more towards helping them get it in, so that we can work on it iteratively. And then for the people who, there was at least 2 people it seemed that particularly had this, like, I don't want to see this merged in. it would be critical for you to get on that PR and put the exact reasons why you say, I want to block this on there so that we can start having those conversations specifically. Ideally, we don't have to have those for an experimental thing, but if you want to have them, put them on the PR.
I just want to note that that's also what extended is for. You do not necessarily have to support it, but given there's multiple implementations that presumably will support it, it's good to have it standardized.
Roger that. So, yeah, look forward to seeing more on the PR, and I think I'll probably go give it another read over myself. So, moving on, let me get back to my screen here since we want to get through what we have left. Oh, okay, there was actually only the one more thing left, but we don't have a ton of time, so let's do it. Rob, you want to talk about PR discussion, issue triage? gRPC
Yeah, I
route
just
backup
added
protocol.
a few basic things. If we can pull up gRPC route PR again.
Yep.
I know Richard, I think Richard, you're on this call. I think you had pushed an update.
Yeah. I think all comments now except for one should be resolved.
I am aware of, and I think it's relevant to this one. Oh, you did. Okay, you updated this. I still have to read this one. I'm involved in this one too because there is some potential problems with some of the not allowing upgrades from HTTP1 to HTTP2 with Nginx. So I'll follow up with you in the PR on that one, but that was one of the lingering things that I was worried about with this.
So I wanna be clear on the wording here. It is okay for the implementation to support upgrades, but it needs to support HTTP2 without first doing an upgrade. Does that make sense?
Indeed.
That makes sense. Okay.
Yeah.
So you need to be able to say from day dot, I want to do HTTP2, right? Like you shouldn't have to shouldn't have to tour through HTTP1 just to get to HTTP2.
Right, and if the implementation did not support that, then there are virtually no gRPC clients today that would be able to use it.
Understood.
Yep,
so is that basically the only remaining comment that we have to resolve?
No, actually, I was referring to a different one.
Gotcha.
Which is
There's my one about it basically comes down to the conflict resolution and first one wins thing.
Yeah, exactly. Right? It's about the conflict resolution and the creation timestamp. So I laid out a series of events here that seem problematic to me, and you can disagree with me if you don't think that, yeah, that's the one. You can disagree with me if you don't think that this series of events is possible. And then I ask, is it possible to check the conditions to see if accepted true is already in there? This series of events seems like a bad situation to me. Yeah,
I 100% agree. There are a lot of weird edge cases because of federal consistency. And yeah, like I think mandating that stuff like hey, or at least saying you should check accepted true. You should check for an accepted true condition and assume that it's there already. The problem is about like what happens when the controller is starting up and you're like it's got like a huge like chunk of Kubernetes events. Like practically that's how it works, is that you get a serial chunk of updates and you don't know how they're going to be ordered. And so at that point you've got to have some rubric, and creation time is I agree, not the best, but there's not many better.
If we can put the implementation must first check for an accepted true, and if it doesn't find any, then it falls back to using creation timestamp, I'm fine with that, as long as there is an intermediary there where it does.
The only problem that I can see about that is that means that then you will need to ensure that there are no pending events, like there are no pending watches, like updates coming in your Kubernetes update cache to be able to check for an accepted true, because you have to check every route, for every HTTP route for an accepted true, right? So you can't that means that then you can't treat each individual route coming in as a thing that you check, right? Because you can't each update to a Kubernetes object. I think in general it's reasonable, but like we just have to be very careful about what happens when you start up the controller and you have a randomly ordered sequence of resources that you want to be able to treat one at a time, right? Like in this case, like you've got to sort of make sure your caches are drained. And what does it even mean for your caches to be drained, right? Like this is probably, we don't need to go into it anymore now, I don't think, but I think that's where a lot of this conflict resolution stuff is kind of sucky is that like you have to allow for that case of how like what happens when the controller is starting up from scratch, and is the question that you need to ask yourself. So I think we need to talk more on that PR about it.
Yeah, fair enough.
I'll just echo what others have said, that I think it makes sense to check for accepted true. I think we have some other discussions in flight about that, and I can't think of the reference right now, but there's been some suggestion of, can we check accepted true and use that more broadly so we don't break quite as frequently. I would suggest two things here. One, we could mirror conflict resolution guidance elsewhere in the API as closely as possible, just to get this in. And then next say, hey, if we say we should check accepted true, that probably doesn't just apply to gRPC route. It applies to HTTP route. If there's a new HTTP route that conflicts, but we already accepted one, we should probably check that too. So I think checking for accepted true feels like something that is a broader fix than this, and also something that could get somewhat controversial.
Yeah, that seems totally reasonable to me. The reason why I didn't do initially in this case is because the conflict here is somewhat different than I think what you're referring to. In this case, we're talking about inter-protocol conflicts, right? HTTP and gRPC. But yeah, I'm fine with that. I'll go ahead and mirror what we have for HTTP route conflicts right now, and then we can maybe deal with this issue later.
Yeah, I think we absolutely need to solve the larger issue. And so having it be the same as a HTTP route one for now, like, gives us a set of problems, but at least they're the same problems as a HTTP route, and then we can solve them once for both. Sorry, Shane,
sounds good to me.
So as an action item, does somebody want to throw up an issue as the follow-up to do the holistic review of how we're doing this, so that we can move this one forward by doing what we do with HTTP route, but then not forget to follow up?
Yeah, it probably makes sense for one of us to generate an issue. I can do it. I suspect we've covered some of this stuff in other issues already. So it may be an issue that we end up closing with duplicate, but I'd rather open an issue and then find that we have a issue that better describes it, and not have, issues are free. Like, rather have too many than not enough. Yeah, exactly. And Costin put in the chat that implementations are probably going to end up translating a gRPC route to effectively a HTTP route anyway, so having the behaviors be similar would be good. Okay.
Roger that. So we'll just have an issue.
Put my name there, please, and I'll.
I use Vim too much. I'm having trouble with Google Docs. Give me a second. What are you in here as?
Yeah, Nick, probably. Yeah,
it's on my thing. I'll do it after. I'll take care of it.
Yeah, sure.
All right,
just put my GitHub tag in brackets as well. Yeah.
There you go. There. I'll remember to do it. All right. So backend protocol.
So it looks like
we got two items there, Rob, that are the same one.
Yeah, I was just going to say that it's the same thing. There's been a lot of discussion here. I actually haven't been as involved as many others on this discussion. So maybe, I know, Nick, you may have the last comment on this one. So maybe you can give an update.
Yeah, so this discussion is about how we handle putting information about the backend service into the API, right? So things that we're talking about here are, if you're doing re-encryption to the backend service from the gateway to the service, where do you put those details? If you want to know that the service supports, maybe you are routing with HTTP route and the service does gRPC, where do you put that information? Maybe it's a HTTP route and the service supports WebSockets, where do you put that? And so basically there's a whole set of things about, like, effectively metadata-ish about the service, about protocol information, or about something that you need to know about the service that we need to store somewhere. And so the original thing that we had said was, oh, we'll just use that protocol for that hand wave, right? That's not sufficient. Like it's pretty clear that that's not sufficient. So a lot of the discussion on here is like, what is sufficient? What sorts of information do we need to do? And the thing that I have sort of been saying here is that I think a lot of what we're talking about here with the protocol that the service supports has a very strong overlap with what we're going to be talking about in the meeting tomorrow for Gamma. In the sense that a service in service mesh terms requires a lot of information about like about the TLS of the service and if it supports WebSockets and a lot of the same stuff that we're talking about here, you'd need to know for a service in a service mesh. And so I think that it's really important that whatever we do something that makes sense for using as a HTTP route backend for like ingress style services, but also using for a mesh style thing. And so my current proposal is that we have it's currently called service metadata resource, but like I think that name is, we can bike shed a lot on that name. But the idea here is that this is a wrapper thing for a service, like a wrapper resource for a service essentially, that basically says, this Kubernetes service is a backend and it now here's some extra information around stuff that we can't fit into the service spec right now. The reason for doing it that way is that the service already has like far too much magic built into it. And we want to be really careful about what we add to it, but also it's really hard to add things to Kubernetes V1 resources, right? Like it takes a long time. You've got to do like a 9 to 12 month cycle to actually get features, to get fields in there. Like it's really difficult to do that. And so if we want to figure out what we need to do, the fastest way is for us to do something that we control that sits in the gateway.kubernetes.io API group, and that has a spec that we can mess with there. So Harry.
So is this a resource about the service owner offering more information, or is it about like telling gateway that go use this information and this is where you route to, right? Like who controls that piece of information, one, and who influences the routing behavior? Is it like service owner tells the gateway, hey, only talk to me on this port using this protocol, using this CA cert and whatnot? Like,
yes. So in my mind, that is a good question. In my mind, the service metadata resource is owned by the service owner. And the reason to use the service metadata resource for the service owner, as opposed to just using the vanilla service, is that you have stuff that can't easily be captured in the service. Now, Costin, I see you. I'm going to get to you in just a sec. I think the thing that we need to be clear on here is we absolutely could do all of this with annotations on the service. History has shown that that is a terrible idea, because if we add annotations on the service, then they will be there forever. We will have to support them forever. No matter what we do with the service, we will end up supporting them forever. So I would rather us have a separate resource and do that. So I think Costin, then Rob.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, naming may discuss it. It's still better than destination rules that we use. My only concern is service meta is restricted kind of to service, but we have stateful sets, we have pod-to-pod communication, which is also a factor. We have other forms of things that are not necessarily a service that may need to be supported, especially in Gamma and in some mesh. But as an idea, I mean, I think it's great to have one resource where you can put this kind of stuff. I don't think we can implement mesh without this.
Rob.
Yeah, no, I think this is probably where we're going to end up. I mean, I haven't spent as much time on it as others on this call, but what strikes me as someone who maybe hasn't been as involved in the conversation is that this started clearly as a discussion of really the limitations of app protocol, right? The app protocol field can't support some nuance that we really need. And it has transitioned into, we really could use a whole new resource. And I think both of these statements can be true, but through this process, I think we've lost, like, if we have a new resource, what does that solve beyond just protocol, right? Because we're not going to have a resource for protocol. So trying to maybe more clearly identify the problems a resource like that could solve. And I think you have, but it's hidden in this conversation, right? As opposed to somewhere else. And so
think that-
maybe, yeah, go ahead.
So yeah, I was just gonna say, yeah, I think that this this conversation here has been like, sort of us coming to the conclusion that, hey, this is a good idea. It is a conversation, so it's been a bit meandering, but like I think I think that there's actually, we're definitely getting closer to something where we could write up a gap, something like that for this. And sorry, what's the 196 class of problems, Harry?
It's all like, where do you put health checking? Where do you put load balancing? Where do you put, I don't know, TLS level details? Where do you put, traffic splitting? We have some solutions, but not all of them, right?
Mhm.
All of those issues, right? We have never solved it. Like we solved some of them with, we have what is the policy resource that we have? The extension model we have, right?
Yeah, so policy attachment. So
Policy attachment, yeah.
Yeah. So people have actually said, I think, Micaiah, you mentioned in a comment that hey, why don't we use policy attachment for this? I think that that in this case, I always intended policy attachment to be for more clearly defined things, not to be. We need to be really careful that we don't end up using policy attachment as a get out of jail free card for like doing proper API design. And I think in this case, we want to do proper API design. This is really key to both HTTP route working properly and whatever we do for mesh working properly. And so that's why I've let this discussion expand, is that it's really important. We're about to start talking officially about what happens with about what happens in Gamma, and this is key for that sort of thing. And so it is Costin is 100% right. It is in effect a policy attachment, but I think we want to be clear that this is like a special type of one. Kaya. Yeah, we are at time, so
Well,
I can
understand
say
what is. All right, I can drop it.
No, that's fine. That's fine. Ask.
Okay, well, I don't understand what is special about this. I mean, you're saying let's define a resource, and then you need to attach it to the backend, and policy attachment is the way you would attach it to the service.
Mm-hmm. So the thing that I would want us to work through is about like a large part of the reason why we did policy attachment is the defaults and overrides things in that, right? Like, and so like, do you want to be able to provide a service metadata policy at the gateway level that affects all services affected by routes on this? And do you want to be able to have that be like a default or an override? That's what the policy attachment thing is for, is to have things where you can specify you can attach a thing to a gateway class and say, I'm going to override the client timeout for everything in this gateway timer in this gateway class. And so that's, I think the defaults and the override are the important part of policy. The fact that we're having a thing that attaches to another thing is not the important part. If you see what I'm saying, maybe we didn't explain that well in the policy attachment docs. Micaiah, you're unmuted, is it?
I didn't quite understand all of that, but that's fine. You can follow up.
So I think I would like to see us start a gap, but I think that given what we saw with the other gap that we looked at today, it occurs to me that, in KEPs, you had the idea of like, provisional, right? And all the different statuses. We haven't used those statuses very well. We've tried to do one big stretch for every gap. It would be completely reasonable in my mind to just state the problem and the motivation, summary, and goals in a first iteration of this, just to get everybody behind the like what and why, but not the how. Because the how could get just as big as that other gap and could be problematic. We'd never be able to do it iteratively, and we'd end up with a big, long, year-long gap that would be open. So maybe we could just start with that. Let's just get all of us behind like merging a gap that just says what we want to do, but not how and why we want to do it.
Great idea, man. Awesome. Love it.
Who's gonna?
I've been doing all the talking here, so yeah, I've been doing all the talking here, so it feels like it's on me to do the gap generation process for this one.
Okay, thank you, Nick. We are at time.
If you're talking, Keith, you're actually muted still.
Yeah, I said I want to be involved with that gap process, and some of the Gamma folks might want to as well, because of the implications.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Like all I'm going to do is do the mechanics of generating an issue that's a gap so that we have a gap number to talk about. And usually the process we do is start a doc, sort of generate most of the text of the gap in a doc before we bring it to a PR, so that we're not backwards and forwards over lots and lots of language bullshit over GitHub, which sucks.
Indeed. All right.
Sorry to be extremely Australian there. I apologize.
No, it's fine. All right, cool. So it seems like the other one that we had was a duplicate of the above to some extent, but we are out of time. So let's follow up on that one next time. And thank you everybody for your time. I'm gonna stop the recording. And
Yeah,
I'll get
before we go, Candace, I want to say I'm really sorry for hijacking your topic. You had questions you want to ask about it. Do you want to quickly ask any of those before we finish everything up?
I'll stick around.
I can stick around.
Can't hear you very well, just barely.
Yeah, I can't hear you at all, Candace.
So can you hear me better?
Yes.
Now?
Yes.
Okay. So the link that I posted was just a comment on the same PR. And it is, we're specifically looking for, what is the way that we're going to provide re-encrypt, and what is the way basically that, what is the solution that different implementers are using to provide re-encrypt. So it's just one part of this, but it's a big important part for us.
Yeah.
And,
I absolutely want to solve. I absolutely think we need to solve that, and we need to have a good solution for it. And so, I think it is key that we have a solution for re-encrypt. But where do we put that information is the question, and that's what this gap will be the answer for.
Yeah, I would say since we're trying to do this gap a little bit more iteratively because it could get very big, I would just say in the first iteration of the gap, just make it one of the motivations. We can capture this as one of the motivations so that we follow up on it in upcoming iterations. And then obviously, I take it this is the comment, right, Candace?
And part of that TLS
Yes.
story could be solved using policy attachment. That's something that we discussed when we authored policy attachment, is okay, you want to validate upstream certificate against a common CA, and want to have how many steps you want to verify against, and what's the TLS version, cipher suits and whatnot. They are a pretty good candidate for policy attachment, and there are no core or extended policy attachments. That is something an implementation has to come out of their own.
Yeah, I think Micaiah said it pretty clearly, how are implementers doing it now? I think most of us who are doing Gateway API implementations are not doing it yet because we haven't described it in the Gateway API. I know for Contour, we are absolutely doing it, and in HTTP proxy, there's ways to specify all the things that you would want to specify, but that's because we already designed the thing in HTTP proxy to do the thing that we're talking about designing here for Gateway API. And I think that's the sort of thing. I know it sucks that we don't have a good answer for you yet, but if there's one thing I've learned from this process of us doing this, that if we rush this, it will end up terrible, and no one will like it. Yeah. So sorry, Candace, does that answer your question for now?
Yeah, there's not enough time probably at the moment. So I can pick it up later if necessary.
Just one comment. It sounds, based on Micaiah's last comment in chat, it sounds like what you're really asking is what are people doing until it's defined in the API itself? I
Yes.
guess. Yes. And that seems like it could use its own discussion, because otherwise I think it may get buried in this one. So maybe starting a new Q&A, basically question and answer. What are other implementations doing? I've seen some success asking in Slack, but you might have a little bit more asking in a GitHub discussion, or both.
That sounds great.
Okay.
Thank you.
Is that something that you're just to make sure we're clear? You're gonna follow up by creating that discussion?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
And I am sorry that we didn't give you enough time to talk about it. I apologize.
Not a problem. Thank you for giving me some time now.
All right, so we got a couple of potential action items. We can, I didn't know if everybody agreed, but I put in here that we could include that specific comment as a motivation in the gap, just so that we're tracking it, even if it ends up in alternatives considered or something. But thus concludes this for now, and we will follow up with you in these upcoming discussions and gaps. Thank you, everybody, for your time. Have
Thanks,
a great
everybody.
night.
See?
Thank you. Bye-bye.